Okay, so I'm going to begin reading in verse 13 of chapter 4. I invite you to follow along, have a Bible open. I'm going to read through verse 17. This is how the book of Ruth comes to an end. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. Then he went to her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Then Naomi took the child, laid him in her lap, and cared for him. The women living there said, "Naomi has a son," and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. And so here at the end of the book of the Ruth, you have all the women of the town have gathered around Naomi and Ruth. This child is laying in Naomi's lap. She's looking down at him, and they proclaim, "Praise be God. He's renewed you. He's sustained you. He's given you a new life. He has not left you without a redeemer." And of course, if there's a before and an after, this is the after. Right? Everything's good. Life is renewed. God has sustained you. You have a redeemer. But I want today, just as we kind of get into the topic of what we're going to talk about, to remind you that there was a before. Before this good news of great joy, where there's this redeemer who's sustained and held on to Naomi's life, there was tragedy. There was loss. There was heartache. And God's people are just, they go through these times of darkness, and I'd like to just spend some time talking about just how dark it was for Naomi so that you can compare it and see the contrast between her good life that she has now. And anyway, this is a story that Naomi was married to a man named Elimelech, and during the time of the Judges, which was a dark time, it was a difficult and uncertain time. During this difficult, dark time, there was a famine that affected this family. They had 2 sons. The sons' names were Mahlon and Chilion. And what happened was a famine struck them. They first sold their property, and they lived off that money for as long as they possibly could. But then finally, when that ran out, they became desperate, so desperate that they decided it would be better if they went away to the land of the Moabites, who were the historic enemies of God's people, to try and make a way there. They intended to only go for a while. They wound up being there for a long time. And what they hoped to avoid in Israel, they found in the land of Moab. First Elimelech died, and then Naomi's 2 sons also died, leaving them in just a tragic situation. And for a widow who found herself in a situation like Naomi, I'd submit to you that there was sort of 4 options for a person like that, for how they might sustain themselves, how they might make a living, how they might go on living, if I can. And I'd like to just catalog these and show you just how desperate Naomi would have gotten. These are the 4 options that she would have had. First, a widow whose husband had died, one of the options she would have is to rent out the family land. Every family was given a piece of land by God, and that was their inheritance. And when the husband died, one of the things a widow could do is rent out the land. And people would come and work there. They would produce crops, and she would receive some amount of money with which she could sustain her life. Only problem for Naomi is what? They've sold the land. So that's not an option. This is not one of the ways she can sustain herself. Second option, your children can take care of you. If your husband's died, if you don't have any land, at least maybe you have some sons, they can work for someone else, and perhaps from what they earn, they can give you something so that you can sustain themselves. Except for Naomi, what? Children are dead. So this is an option. Maybe number 3, you could get married. However, we're going to see that this isn't an option either. And here's the reason why. She's too old. And you say, what? Too old? You get married as old? No. In that day, people, they didn't marry for the same reasons we marry today. The main reason a husband took a wife was to produce children. And she was beyond childbearing years. It was very unlikely that anyone would ever try to take her on just to take care of her. She really had this, it was not an option. She was too old. In fact, at one point in the book, we'll see it later as we're reading, she said, look, I won't get a husband. I'm too old. Number 4, you could work in the fields and, go out and glean and maybe just try and get a little bit for yourself. Except for Naomi, same problem. She's too old. In fact, later on, we'll see this. Ruth, who's younger, is actually the one who will go out and work for them both because she's physically not capable. And so among the 4 options for how a widow would take care of herself, none of these would work for her. She's economically without hope. She's gone bankrupt. She has no land. Her children are dead. She has no ability to care for herself. There's not going to be another husband in the picture. She's economically, she's bankrupt. There's no hope. There's this dark cloud that's sort of overtop her, and there's no light shining in. And I'd maybe even take it one step farther, probably spiritually without hope. She has no family. She has no inheritance. She has no name. And so even, at some point she says, I've become bitter. God's dealt me a heavy hand. I'm bitter. And for her, and I want you to see this because we're going to get to the after, and there all the town people are gathered around her, and look at what God has done. He's renewed and sustained your life. He's left a redeemer for you. Before that, there's this dark cloud hanging over her where there's just, you cannot see a way forward. And that's one of the reasons I think that the story has so much potential to reach so many of us, because so many of us, we get to that place in our life where there's no options. Look what's happened. And even sitting in this room, I'm sure there's some of us who are either there now or have been at some point. Okay, that's the before. There's an after. The before is dark. The after is, wow, look at what God has done. There's something in the middle. And that something in the middle is this, that there's a redeemer. And I want to spend some time talking about this because in the book of Ruth, there's not just one redeemer. There's this obvious one redeemer. We'll talk about him. But there's actually a second, less obvious redeemer. But once you see it, you'll never unsee it. But even more than that, there's a third redeemer, which is the key to understanding this book. And in fact, once we get there, I'll suggest it's the key to understanding our lives today. And so between the before and after, I want to talk about what's here in the middle, the fact that there's a redeemer, not just one, not just two, but actually 3. And so let's dive in. The first one's totally obvious. In fact, look at verse 14 of chapter 4. The women surround Naomi and they say, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer." They're speaking about Boaz. Boaz is explicitly called the kinsman redeemer. And maybe some of us were here today. What in the world is a kinsman redeemer? I had that same question, and I started thinking through, how am I going to explain what a kinsman redeemer is? And what I decided to do, and I do this every once in a while, I drew some pictures to help us kind of wrap our mind around it. And they're not that good, I'll tell you ahead of time, but hopefully you'll understand better once I show you this. So here we go. Let's talk about history in Israel. In Israel, a family received as an allotment or inheritance a piece of land. Here's how it happened. When God's people wandered through the desert, God finally brought them across the Jordan River. They inherited this land that God provided for them. God actually, he did this. He divided that land up into plots. And every single family received as an allotment or an inheritance a piece of land. And so every family, they had, this is my piece of land. This is my family's piece of land. You could stand there, and this is what God has given to me. If you looked over at the boundary stones, there was another piece of land over there that belonged to another family. There was another boundary over here with boundary stones. There was another family that had that. Now when I say this is my piece of land, I don't mean it in kind of ultimate sense. God didn't give people land and it's now mine. Everyone in Israel understood this. Ultimately, it was all God's land. And we who own the land, we're just tenants there, stewards. God's given it to us as a gift. We take care of it. God provides for us through this land. But it's not ultimately mine. Even though I say this is my land, it's ultimately God's. But everyone had that as a gift. Now, in order to understand the book of Ruth, here's what happened. God, I think, saw ahead of time the kind of realities of life. That there were some people who, I don't know any better way to put this, some people who are just more talented. They're better with business, they're better farmers, they just have more talent. Then there are other people who are less talented. Just they're duds, they don't know what to do in life. And so it would be possible that at some point you would just become so poor that you need a bailout, so to speak. Also, beyond just the talents, the kind of varieties of circumstances, some of us, and this happens, right? There's just some people, it just seems like, man, they got everything. And then others of us who are like, man, the circumstances of our life, why is everything against me? And whether through the talents of life or the circumstances of life, it so happens that some people, they get distressed, they become poor, and they need some help. And so what happened, and by the way, everything I'm about to talk about, you could read in Leviticus chapter 25. If you want to write that down, take a look at it later. It's all as a background to the book of Ruth. This is what could happen. A family like this who got into trouble, they could sell that land. Like, here's my land, but I'm in trouble. I have no food, I have no money, and I don't know, what is a piece of land worth? Let's just say it's worth $250,000, $250,000. I've hit hard times, I can't feed my family, I'm going to sell my land. You could sell that land for, let's say, $250,000. So some rich person who was much better farmer, much better businessman, who had built up some amount of wealth, could come along, he could take a portion of his wealth and give it to you, and now that piece of land would belong not to you, but to that person. And this is actually the story of the book of Ruth. It's what Elimelech and Naomi did. They sold that land, but then what happened is this famine went on, and they began to live off that money, and it began to dwindle until finally, whoa, now what? And it became very tragic because there was a famine. They didn't know what to do. They moved to the land of Moab, and actually the story of the book of Ruth winds up this way. She's all alone, no husband, no sons to work the fields to help take care of her. She's no money, no family, no land, no anything. The options totally limited. Now, this is the story of the book of Ruth, what happened to Naomi. I want to back up because there's some things that you need to know. Let's just go back to the fact that there's a whole family. Okay, land is gone. The Bible, and again, you can read about this in Leviticus 26, it actually gave two different ways in which this problem, long term, could be rectified. Because here's what God, he didn't want like a few people to finally buy up all the land and everybody else have basically nothing and be poor. He wanted all his people to have access to something. And so you can read about this in Leviticus 25. There were two provisions he made, one of which was this. Every 50 years, it didn't matter what had happened, it didn't matter the ups and downs, who went bankrupt, whose wealth soared. Every 50 years, there was a reset. Your family got the land back, free and clear. It was called the Year of Jubilee. It was a time of great celebration in Israel. Like everybody, every 50 years, and it would benefit mostly the kids, right? Their parents, they didn't have it. They faced tough times. They lost the land. It goes back to the family. God wanted it that way. He wanted his people to have a future and have a hope. So every 50 years, there was this time of Jubilee. The land came back. But 50 years is a long time, right? I mean, if you're a kid and your parents have lost the land, that is a long time. So there's a second provision God made. And here's what that second provision was. That it was actually a duty or obligation of close, near family members that if you went destitute and you lost everything, these near family members were called kinsman redeemers. And here's what they did. They brought their money, and it was just written into the contract. You see, when the person bought the land, it didn't become their land in an ultimate way. It still belonged to the family. It was just they had the right to produce and sell the crops there. But as part of the contract, it was just this way that every family could designate some kinsman redeemers who could come with their money, and let's say the land had sold for $250,000, could take a portion of their money at $250,000 or something like that. They could give it back to the person who bought the land, and it would belong to the family again. Does that make sense? And that person would go away, and the kinsman redeemer would go away, and the family's restored. And this is what, Leviticus 25, it lays it all out. There are these people, next of kin, called kinsman redeemers, who it was their legal right to come and buy that land back so their family would have a future. And that's one of the things they did. Now, in the book of Ruth, this whole story gets complicated. And I want to try and explain that. So here's Naomi. She's by herself. Her sons have died. Her husband has died. And she has nothing. And here's what happens. For her, a kinsman redeemer comes along. And he can pay. And so, normally what would happen then is that it would, that person would be cut out. And now this land would belong to her and her children and their children after them, right? Except, wait a second, no children, so who's it going to belong to? So, Leviticus 25 explains this as well, this person would have an additional obligation. Here's what it would be. You would have to take this woman to be your wife, produce children with her, which, by the way, would not be your own children. They would be considered the children of the dead husband. And one more thing, of course, when you get married, all your wealth becomes, you know how this works in marriage, right? Like all your stuff is now their stuff, right? And that's the way it was, which I want you to see how costly this was, because the book of Ruth actually goes out of its way to explain just how costly this was when Boaz redeemed the land and this family and took Ruth to be his wife. I want you to understand what it was that he did and how costly it was. Let's start here, because this will be important later. When Ruth comes back with Naomi, you have to know what a difficult, dangerous place she was in. I want you to see this in chapter 2. So she goes out to glean in the fields, chapter 2, verse 8. And actually Boaz, when he first meets her, he says something to her that explains what a difficult, dangerous place she was in. You see, she was a foreigner. She was single. She had no husband, no protector. It would have been everyday, normal, commonplace for people to mistreat her, abuse her, take advantage. She was in such danger. You can see it reflected in Boaz's words, verse 8 of chapter 2. He comes up, he says, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the girls. I have told the men not to touch you." Why would he have to say that to his men? Because otherwise they would. It shows what kind of danger she's in. In fact, when people gleaned, they gleaned along the edges of the field. If you keep reading this chapter, Boaz, he says, listen, don't stay by the edge of the field. I don't want someone else from another field to grab you or take advantage of you. Come into the middle where my harvesters are harvesting and just harvest along with them. Which, when she does that, she gets back home to Naomi. She's been harvesting in the field, not just taking the gleanings. She gets home and Naomi, whoa, where'd you get all this? And she explains, there was this man, his name was Boaz, and he did all this. And I want you to see Naomi's response, because she sees, man, what grace he's had upon this strange woman. Look with me at verse 20. She tells Naomi, the man's name is Boaz. Verse 20, Naomi says, "The Lord bless him. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." And she added, "That man is our close relative. He is one of our kinsman redeemers." When Naomi sees the grace, the mercy, the love that Boaz has had for Ruth, she gets this first spark of hope. Maybe. This man, he's so kind. Maybe there's some hope. And so she actually gives some instructions. Ruth, in the middle of the night when he's sleeping, go lay down next to him. Ask him to spread the corner of your garment over him. She does. And we probably don't get the reference here. But in that culture, spreading the corner of your garment over someone was saying, I want to marry you. So when she comes and asks, when you spread the corner of your garment over me, she's basically down on one knee saying, Boaz, will you marry me? And he says, yes. And I don't know, have you read this through the week? You remember the complicating thing? She said, yes, but, oh, wait a second. I'm not the nearest relative. Someone else is in first place. And he actually, and you can see this at the beginning of chapter 4, he goes to that person who's in first place, and he says, okay, look, in fact, let's just read the words. Verse 3. Then Boaz said to the kinsman redeemer, that's the nearest relative, Naomi, who's come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our brother Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so, but if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I'm in the next in line. And look what he says. Oh, yeah, I want the land. He says, I will redeem it. And so just to kind of follow our slides here, he's in a position like this, right? Oh, yeah, I want that land. I'm going to give him some money, and now I'll own the land. Boaz says, wait, hold on. Now I want you to look at the next verse. Verse 5, on the day you buy the land from Naomi and from Ruth the Moabitess, you will acquire the dead man's widow in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. At this, the kinsman redeemer says, then I can't redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it. If it was just this, he could get the land back, fine. I'll do it. But when he realizes it's this, like, whoa, that's too costly. No, that's too much. And so he says, no, Boaz, go ahead. I only bring this up, the book of Ruth brings it up, to show you at what cost Boaz went about. You see, he took from his own wealth to pay the debts of someone who could not pay themselves. And it's not just that. In this case, not only did he pay the debts of someone who could not pay, he also took of all his wealth, and as a husband taking her on, he made all his wealth hers. And so everything that belonged to him now belongs to her, which is why at the end, all the women of the town are like, wow, it's all been restored. You were poor. You had nothing. Now you're rich. You're wealthy. May God be praised. He has provided a kinsman redeemer. You see, Boaz is a redeemer in this story. He's the most obvious redeemer. There's a second redeemer. A little less obvious, but once you see it, you won't unsee it. Maybe you noticed this. What's the name of the book? It's not the book of Boaz. It's the book of Ruth. And man, I really want you to see this. Turn back to chapter 1. She actually is maybe a bigger redeemer, a more important redeemer. After all, they named the book after Ruth. So going back, there's this tragedy that strikes this family. And Naomi is left with just these two daughter-in-laws. She at one point, when she decides she's going to go back to Bethlehem, she turns to the daughters-in-law and says, listen, don't come with me. Stay here. In fact, let's read her words, verse 11 of chapter 1. She says to her daughters, return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I'm too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has gone out against me. In other words, like, look, I've had to swallow a bitter pill. My life stinks. But your life doesn't have to. You can still have it good. You have families, you have a place to live, you have a name, you have potential suitors. You can still have a good life. I can't. Just stay here. I'm going. Orpah listens. She says, okay, I'm going home. I'm gonna have a bright future. Ruth does something different. I want you to see, her words, by the way, are probably the most famous words in the book of Ruth, beginning in verse 16. She says, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I'll stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I'll die, and there I'll be buried. She says, may the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me. Let's talk about these words for a second. Ruth basically is going to become an immigrant. She's going to leave her home country, all the things that are familiar, and she's going to go and live in Israel. This works so well because here in America, we're like a land of immigrants. And probably in this room, there are some of us who we were first-generation immigrants. We came from another country. We came here. Others of us, it was our parents or our grandparents. Most of us, in some way, are closely connected to people who immigrated. When you left your home country, all your language, your culture, the things that were familiar, or your parents did, or your grandparents did, why? Why would anyone leave what's familiar, the comfort zone, their language, their people, to go to an uncertain place? Why? A better future, right? No one leaves thinking, boy, I hope my life gets worse. I mean, it might, but we leave thinking, I want a better life. I want a better future. I want to go and have some hope. Every immigrant does that, except for, in the history of the world, maybe it's just this one. When she leaves, she's not hoping for a better future. In fact, she knows it's going to be worse. She knows the danger she's going to run into. In fact, these are her words, the oath she takes. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you from me. What's the anything? She knows, I'm going to face tragedy. I'm going to face heartache. People are going to abuse me, take advantage of me. I could stay here. I could have a husband. I could have a good life. But I'm going to actually leave as an immigrant knowing that my life is going to be much worse. Why would Ruth do that? Two thoughts. One, at least part of it has to be her faith. She's seen Naomi as God. She's put her faith and trust in Naomi as God. She knows if she stays, she may become wealthy. She may have a better future, at least on the outside. But probably her faith is going to dwindle and die. If she goes, she'll have a worse life economically. She'll face danger and hardship, but her faith may grow. What a difficult but clear decision she made. And I think it must have been, look, nothing else matters except my relationship to God. That must have been part of it. There was a second thing, though, too. Ruth knew something about Naomi. She knew if Naomi goes alone, she has no hope. She has no future. She'll die. She knows that. If Naomi goes alone, she'll die. She thinks to herself, if I go, though, I may be able to work in the fields. I may be able to keep her alive. Which I want you to think about what she did. In order to keep her mother-in-law alive, she basically made a decision to throw her life away. In order that her mother-in-law may have a chance at becoming enriched, she purposefully made a choice to impoverish her own life. She left the comforts of home for an uncertain and dangerous future in order to save her mother-in-law. She made this decision. I'm going to throw my life away. She's like the ultimate suffering servant. She puts her mother-in-law first and makes a decision. She will suffer just to help this person in her life. And that's why I think this book is called the Book of Ruth. When Naomi is holding this child in her hand, and the women of the town are gathered together, and they say, praise be to God, He's renewed your life. He sustained you. He's given you a new hope and a new day. One of the reasons is because there's a second redeemer in this book. Her name is Ruth. And, okay, now I said this, there's not just one, there's not just two, there's actually a third. And it's certain in this book that the third is the most important, the key to understanding the book. You didn't understand the book yet unless you realized there's a third redeemer. I want you to see this. Look at the very end of chapter 4. Like, that's how the story should end, right? With this child in her lap. But it doesn't. it ends with a genealogy that looks forward to what God is going to finally do in his plan. It ends with David in verse 22. And if you were here last week, we realized it doesn't just end with David. It even goes further to what God is going to do through Jesus. This story is a story that looks forward to God's plan of redemption in Jesus. And I'd like to talk about that. So I want you to think this through. In this book, there's two redeemers. One of them is Boaz. The other is Ruth. And who's Boaz? He is the one who will take from his wealth, who will pay the debts of someone who's totally bankrupt, and who will even go one step farther. He's like the ultimate bridegroom who loves so much that he's willing to take on this wife so that all the wealth that he owns becomes hers. So he's a debt payer and a bridegroom. Okay, that's one redeemer. There's another redeemer. Her name is Ruth. I want you to think about who she is. She is a person who is willing to suffer so that her mother-in-law might thrive. She's a person who's willing to throw her life away in order to save the life of her mother-in-law. She's the other redeemer, and here's what's fascinating. These two redeemers come together, and the story starts looking forward all the way to here. And I want you to realize that Jesus is the third and better, more perfect Redeemer. He's like the amalgamation of these two brought back together. Who is Jesus? He is the one who, when we sinned, when we fell astray, he became our kinsman, right? What did he do? He took on human flesh so he'd be a member of our family, so that he'd be qualified to do the redeeming. And what is it he's done? You realize when we pray the Lord's Prayer, what we pray, right? Father, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debt. Why do we pray, Father, forgive us our debts? It's because we, as sinful human beings, our sin actually accumulates a debt that we cannot pay ourselves. And what we could not pay, God actually, he sent his son, and this is what's awesome. From the wealth of who he is, not only did he pay our debts, but the Bible says that he took us to be his bride, so that all his wealth becomes ours. I want you to think about what that means. That the Bible, it says this, that all the wealth of God now belongs to those who Jesus has come to redeem. In that way, Jesus is just like Boaz. He's paid our debt and took us, his church, to be his bride. But even better than Boaz, he's also like Ruth. Who was Ruth? She was the one who threw her life away in order to save ours, who impoverished herself to make Naomi rich. I want you to think about who Jesus is, who left the glories and riches of heaven, who left the throne of heaven to be born in a manger, who impoverished himself in order to make us rich. I want you to think about who this Jesus is, who threw his life away in order to save ours. You see that? This story, Jesus is an amalgamation. This story is about this third Redeemer. This third Redeemer who came to save us. This book actually holds the key to our life. Listen, I don't know what you walk through these doors with today, what the circumstances of your life are, what kind of dark cloud hung over your head. But I do know this: when we were hopeless, unable to pay the debts of our sin, cut off from God, God sent a Redeemer in the person of Jesus Christ. He announced it ahead of time again and again and again and again. A Redeemer better than Boaz, better than Ruth, who saves us completely, who offers to us the riches of heaven because he threw his life away in order to save ours. And if you haven't put your faith and trust in Jesus, why not today? In Jesus, there is a Redeemer.